Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another episode, indeed another series of A Foggy Day on Olympus. Olympus, where the Greek gods lived, passing Olympian judgments on the world, way above the foolish arguments of mere mortals, and that is certainly what we intend to do, but it is a little bit foggy up here, so yeah, that's our ongoing problem. But more seriously, these are grown-up discussions for grown-up people. We're not taking always easily predictable partisan lines on this, that, and the other thing, but we're trying to follow, if you like, the Renaissance principle of ad fontes, going back to the origins and looking at things in terms of their actual content rather than some preconceived categories, whether religious even, and certainly not political right or political left. So, yeah, this is the place to come to get offended. If you want your already existing beliefs confirmed, then there's a bazillion other podcasts and websites out there on the interwebs. My name's Mike Pierce, and I always forget to say that.
I figured if I just wait long enough, eventually you'll say something about it. Well, my name is Coel Campo, and today we are introducing a new series that I am particularly excited about because I just think this stuff is so interesting, but also so important for people to have an understanding of. And so the title of the series is called Sexual Chaos and Identity Crisis. And we wanted to note that this episode today, in particular, and the next episode will be focusing on issues of identity. And the last two episodes in the series will be more about the sexual revolution and the effects of that.
Yeah, the effects of that on identity. So we're laying our groundwork today. Now, in a previous series, in Why the Rest Hates the West, episode 5, we talked a lot about the historical roots and origins of forms of collective identity that get taken for granted today, and pointing out that they are not eternal, they are of relatively recent origin. But today we're not doing that so much. We're looking at the situation as we face it now. What does a typical person, certainly in a Western country, think of when they think about, who am I? And that is the title of today's episode. So, who am I? Is it something I was born with, or is it something that I choose? And as I think we're going to see through the course of this session, the things that we were born with are certainly there. They're certainly important, but they're losing out progressively to the kind of self-invention of the things that we choose.
Yeah, I think the idea being that people want to say the things that I choose say more about me than the things that I was born with, right? Just because I had no choice in what I was born with. So it says a lot more about me depending on, what flavor of ice cream I like or what clothes I decide to wear or something like that.
Yeah, and it's viewed, I think, by a lot of people as a sort of liberation, isn't it? That I freed myself from these imposed identities and I'm expressing a real me, but that is in itself creating a kind of a crisis, which I think we'll get to maybe in a few minutes.
Yeah. Depending on how much you think about these kinds of things, right away your mind will jump to like some of the more extravagant identities that people make up for themselves. But I was just thinking too that sometimes we see this play out in like a more heartwarming way, right? Like if somebody can't walk, let's say, I could choose to be bound to this infirmity that I have, or I can choose to transcend this and be somebody else, and this infirmity doesn't define who I am. So I was just thinking that there's some interesting nuances that we're going to be talking
Right,
about.
right, like the Disability Olympics and these kinds of things, yes. But also in the area of careers and so on, yeah. And I want to be clear here, simply by identifying these things doesn't necessarily mean that we're knocking them. We're kind of analysing them to see, lifting the lid on ourselves to see what's under the hood, what's there.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Well, we're drawing up a little chart here, as will become apparent as we work our way through this. And on the left-hand side here, we've got traditional or inherited outlooks on ourselves and our identities. And on the right-hand side, individualist or chosen outlooks and identities. So let's start with this one, national. Now, as we pointed out again in the episode that I indicated a moment ago, national identity isn't really traditional at all. In fact, it's modern and it's Western derived, even though it's spread over pretty much all of the planet. Although there's still plenty of people who don't feel that and sense that about themselves. This, of course, is one of the difficulties that Westerners had when they tried to, as I rather polemically and jeeringly say, turn Iraq and Afghanistan into Belgium. Lo and behold, it didn't happen. But not least because lots of the people who lived there didn't actually see themselves as Iraqis or Afghans, but having other forms of belonging. But nevertheless, this has pretty much swept the globe over the last couple of hundred years. And since the early 20th century, in the West at least, it's come to be perceived not as liberal or even radical as it used to be, but as conservative. For reasons we could talk about at length, but we're not going to talk about at all. The big turning point on that one is World War One. But we'll just say that now and not explain it, but that's the way this has worked. So by now, it's understood as something traditional and inherited, your nationality.
Right. Yeah, we're talking about patriotism, not nationalism, which is something that we've talked about a lot in previous episodes.
Yeah, nationalism is predicated on national consciousness. If people don't have a national consciousness, then nationalism is impossible. But that doesn't mean that everybody with national consciousness is going to become a nationalist. We might hope that they would be a patriot for the same reason that we hope that people love their mother. It's basically an extension of the same thing, right?
Right.
Nobody's country is actually the greatest in the world. The reason that you should think that is that you should think your mother is the best mother in the world, even
Yes.
though logically this can't be true. But the reason that you should think like that, at least in a soft sense, is because it's yours, right? And that's good.
I always find it interesting when people, especially in the US, lots, I don't know, we could argue all day, but I think is a country that at least has done pretty well in the past. The present may be debatable, but I always find it funny when people that were born here despise the country that they live in. That it just confuses me.
I suspect that something is true amongst many of those kind of people, as is true amongst. I'm trying not to get very political here, but let's say some of their opponents. They are very often people without any real experience, or maybe literally no experience of any country but their own. And so no real idea of how things could be different or why things in America or whatever country it is are the way they are. They only know that there are things they don't like.
Yes.
And then, of course, we could get right into the weeds as to whether they're right to think that way or wrong, or whether they're right but it can't easily be changed. And we're not going to get down to those weeds. But yeah, it is certainly very perplexing when people talk the way you described. And sometimes, of course, annoying. Yes.
Right. And I think probably the reason that this has changed is because now you could decide to live somewhere else pretty much rather easily if you wanted to.
Well, I did it twice. Not once, but I'm a serial offender. Right?
I honestly didn't even think of that.
Because I live in a sort of perpetual nowhere, is in your head. I mean, I do in my head. right?
Well, now we know what's really
I
wrong
know
with
I
you.
lived in Croatia, and yes, I love it. I lived in America. I love that. I lived in Britain, and it drove me crazy sometimes, but I still love that. Yes. So, but nevertheless, okay. Leaving aside unusual people like yours, truly, most people have a strong sense of belonging to some nation, and the stronger that is in them, the more likely they are to be considered some kind of conservative, at least as far as the present kind of spectrum of opinion goes, right? So that's kind of inherited and, by now at least, traditional. Well, let's look at another category here. And I want to make a distinction between different kinds of religious belonging, ethnic or familial religious confessions, especially perhaps Catholic, Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, and the values that they uphold in consequence of those religious confessions. So, by and large, and of course, this is becoming a little bit less true all the time, but still overwhelmingly, people who are Catholic today, or Orthodox, or Jewish, or Muslim, are the children of the previous generation of Catholics, Orthodox, Jews, and Muslims, right?
Right.
Even though it's becoming a little bit more true, and perhaps especially in America, that some of them will previously have been something else.
Hmm.
And also that some of the children of those previous generations will have switched away, maybe to become agnostic or atheist.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's also just like people tend to agree with the family values that they were raised in, right? And so there's a whole sociological component going on that some people in their religious mind would want to ignore.
Right. I mean, it's often pointed out, for example, with Jewish people, and perhaps particularly in Israel, that uh, there's a whole range of possible opinions and levels of belief, and loads of people who are completely secular, maybe even atheistic, but who would nevertheless be annoyed if one of their number, for example, became a Christian. Because you can be an atheist, but you better be a Jewish atheist, right? So, because it's about solidarity with the group. There's this famous anecdote, I think it was Christopher Hitchens, that's it, who was a great secularist campaigner, who was going into Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and they got held up by some gunmen, and they were asked, I won't attempt the accent, although I can do it in short bursts, but I'll probably only embarrass myself, whether he was a Catholic or a Protestant. And he said, I'm an atheist. And there was a pause, and the gunman shot back, Catholic atheist or Protestant atheist?
Right.
So it, a lot of it is not necessarily even just belief. It's kind of like ethnic and familial solidarity.
Right.
And that's why it's kind of, you know, inherited.
Yeah, and I find this one interesting too because I think, especially as Christians, right? Like, if you're a Christian, that's supposed to be your entire identity, right? Like, the church spends a lot of time talking about your identity in Christ, which is good and important. But I think what's interesting is that religion has become, I think, like an attachment to your identity. And I think that's true of like a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, including, nationalism is like, and we've talked about this before in the Why the Rest series, but when you identify yourself, you have multiple sort of signifiers, and they're all like attachments to your identity. I am this religion, I'm from this place. What's most important is who you are as an individual, but I'm made up of these different things. And so yeah,
Right.
I find that funny that religion is supposed to encompass your entire identity, but rarely I think it does anymore.
Well, yeah, and that can be a little bit worrying. And you look at a lot of people, and I said something particularly that provoked a number of viewers in a previous episode, and I'll see if I can get it right now because maybe some people missed it, and it'd be good to provoke them as well. That lots of people who claim some religious identity, actually, their politics is their religion. And the
Yes.
religious verbiage, it is literally that. It's just so much supposedly justifying verbiage lying over the top of it. which is kind of obnoxious, really. Yeah, yeah.
Right, right.
Okay,
Well, it
so
doesn't it doesn't help when religious leaders, start, or I'm sorry, it doesn't help when political leaders start claiming certain religions as part of their platform, but we won't get into that.
you would have been right the first attempt as well when religious leaders start playing politics.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm not going to name any names. It'd be just too easy. And yeah, okay. Well, thirdly, in this column, we should mention extended family and neighbours as social support. Remember that in the pre-modern world, and this was something you also discussed in the Why the Rest episode 5, was way more important than national identity. People belonged to an extended family. And to an extent, some people still have that. Not very much in the West now. Most people still have fairly significant attachment to, their parents and maybe an aunt or two. Although families are smaller now, the extension isn't so big, laterally at least, as a social support network. But also, at least in the past, and perhaps still in some rural areas, and certainly outside the West, your neighbours as well. Personal contacts. Now, this is something that is still a reality here. Um, People use personal contacts as a way of getting things done, and I've done that on a number of occasions since moving here. I would have been sunk without trace, right? But at one level, of course, this does still happen in the West, even though it's not supposed to, and it's considered to be, not the done thing. So people get into elite colleges, or even more ordinary colleges, because their parents were there or some other kind of contact. Even in Britain, even in the early 1980s, I got my first mortgage on a house because my dad was in a position to lean quite hard on the bank because he had a lot of money in there. So these kind of things do still happen, and if the surnames we say in America, the second names of a lot of pop stars and actors sound awfully familiar to most of us as they're starting their careers in their early 20s or something. That's because loads of them are the children of the previous generation of Hollywood stars and what have you, and on it goes. So it hasn't disappeared even in the West.
Right. Yeah, I think I said this when we were talking about it in Why the Rest, but I think it's so interesting that us in the West, we all know that this isn't supposed to happen. You're
Right,
supposed to achieve the things that you do on your own merits, but we're all aware that it is happening and therefore trying to leverage that in our own way as much as possible. And so it's just sort of funny to me, but it's one of those things you can't get rid of, right? Like people are always going to use the means accessible to them. So
right. I remember this is going back a little bit now, maybe 15 years, something like that in the UK. There was this outrage in the press in Britain because some senior politicians, whilst wanting to restrict parental choice for schools, had themselves found reasons to get their own children into really good schools in nice areas or to go for private schools, which the government of that day strongly disapproved of.
right,
And I felt so lonely. I was outraged too. I wasn't outraged because these people were doing this. They were being good parents. They were doing what any parent would do. I was outraged that these same politicians were attempting to forbid the rest of us from doing what we could and should for our own children, and how dare they?
right.
But yeah, it's natural human behavior.
Yeah, yeah. This has already been going on in the West for quite a while, but I think this changed even more after 2020 and COVID. I think people are even more isolated now than they have been even in the past. And so it's even more difficult to make connections now with people than it was before.
Ah, yeah. So people are falling back on family because the world outside. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I think
Well,
yes, yeah, I think that is definitely true to some extent. I have heard multiple stories of people reuniting in a way with their family because they needed more support that they didn't have without it, but also just that people are making less connections in general. You might make a connection with your neighbor or with somebody at your place of worship,
yeah,
or something like this. People aren't going out and about as much anymore. You know, they're staying home, they're working from home, they're
yeah,
attending church online. And so I think it's a lot more difficult to make those connections at all.
right, right. So in that sense, the historic process is kind of reversing itself at least a little bit.
Right, right,
Right. Okay, well, let's come to our second column here, the other side. And this is going to strike a lot of people as odd, and perhaps particularly in America, but also maybe to a lesser extent in some other countries too. Conversionist or personally chosen religious affiliation, not inherited religion. So our picture here is of a Billy Graham rally from the 50s, and he's got his hands in the air, and I suppose he can't be saying, "I want you to get up out of your seats there," because they're all standing. But anyway, I want you to come forward, or something like that. People coming forward, being converted. That this is an individually chosen act, not an inherited religion. The reason this will seem a little funny in America is because a large majority of the current generation of evangelicals, say, will be the children of the previous generation of evangelicals. Right? So that although the theory is different, we baptize believers once they come to a place of personal choice, not babies. The instinct for parents to want their children to follow in their footsteps, and for at least sometimes children to want to follow in those footsteps, is still there.
right,
But in theory, that's the idea.
right. Yeah, and I think this changes the way that we go about our church marketing, right? Like I think there's much more marketing towards individuals and maybe less so towards family, or maybe just less support for families and more of a focus on drawing in individuals as they are. So
Right. I don't know the statistics, but I would be astonished if it were not the case that evangelical churches have a bigger throughput across generations. That is, that they have a larger number of people whose parents were not part of those kind of churches, and also that they lose more of their children than, say, the Catholic Church. But
right.
of course, America being the religious marketplace that it is, there are going to be people chopping and changing and drifting out into nothing and agnosticism, and people who were previously agnostic becoming religious all the time. Because that's what America is like. That's one of the things that build America. But nevertheless, the point we just made will be true to a lesser extent in other countries as well, even with these churches. So they're, at least in theory and a lot more in practice, they are chosen religious confessions and religious bodies.
Yeah.
And in that
And I
sense, part of self actualization.
Yeah, and I think you were kind of talking about this earlier, but it's funny to me that it's considered oppression, almost. You know, if you were forced to go into this religion, like if you grew up with fundamentalist evangelical parents and they said you have to subscribe to this faith, otherwise we're going to disown you, and that's considered like that's completely wrong. Just on so many levels. But I think it's so funny that in previous generations or just historically that it wasn't considered strange at all. Now that's something that people feel so violently about. But all you have to do is look back a couple hundred years and it's like, oh yeah, that's just how it works and nobody was offended by it.
Well, no, but that's because we are living in an age of extreme self affirmation and self invention. So simply being taught stuff as a kid, if that's then rejected in adult life, the story they will tell is this was, and here's the famous phrase, shoved down my throat.
Yes.
Well, you were going to be taught something by either your parents or by that generation for reasons that they thought good. There is no neutral upbringing. This, of course, is why, particularly in a politically polarized age, compulsory state education simply means that the state schools are a perpetual battleground between people in society who want that upbringing to be very different kinds of things.
Right.
So, yeah. Okay, well, moving on to consider something like work now, the work that everybody does during the course of their life. Professions are now something that is chosen. It's not something that you inherit from your parents, right? You don't inherit the same plot of land that they did and work on that for the same landlord. You don't become the blacksmith because your father was the blacksmith. Some people go into their parents' line of work, but that's more as a result of influence and people thinking that was a good kind of thing. So I don't think I was the only one, but I may be nearly the only one amongst my male siblings and cousins who didn't go into print because my dad was in print. He was a linotype operator for the Financial Times, and a number of my uncles and my grandfather were in the same line of work. And I was the rebel and went out into academia. And what did my daughter do? Go into academia in a similar line of work. And our husband the same. And now their eldest son wants to become a history teacher, and I'm so proud of him.
You've changed the course of the Pierce family forever.
Dreadful, dreadful. The curse continues, cascading down the generations. But those are, in the first place, much less usual now than that kind of phenomenon used to be. And they're certainly not in any sense forced or pressured. It's simply because, some people are tolerably good parents, and some of the children thus brought up think, I'm going to do what my mum did or my dad did or something like that, or something very similar anyway.
Right.
And yeah, but we are now in the age of the chosen profession where we decide what we're going to be for ourselves. It's not simply something given as it was in traditional societies. We have free markets. I can hardly use the term without smirking. Free markets don't really exist anywhere. We have countries that flatter themselves they have free markets, but there is at least some degree of choice in what you buy, right? Even if in practice it's dominated by a few mega corporations with sometimes some small businesses slipping between the cracks. It might sound a bit jaundiced, but I'm jaundiced. But, but at least there's some measure of choice entailed. And similarly with business, right? Business is actively looking for people who might or might not be their customers. People are looking to buy things, maybe from this firm, maybe from that. They're making choices. And particularly when we consider consumerism, that is our tendency to buy things because we like the way they look or how they reflect upon us. And this is particularly true in the area of clothes and to a lesser extent with cars, I guess. But maybe also with things like soft furnishings. We want to project ourselves as being a particular kind of person. I suppose our furnishings at home aren't going to be seen by anybody but those we know well enough to invite to our home. But nevertheless, as we look at them all day, every day, and live amongst them, they tell us that we are a certain kind of person, as all this stuff does just behind my shoulders. Somehow, people, honestly.
Right.
So yeah, consumerism is part of our self-expression in a way that was previously only true of the mega rich who could afford to make those kinds of choices.
Yeah. Yeah, my unpopular opinion about this is that I feel like there's a certain amount of danger in being able to choose whatever profession you think that you want, because just because it's something that you enjoy doing and want to do doesn't necessarily mean that you're good at it. And so yeah, I just
Is
I
this
just
the co-ed variant on the people get promoted to the level of their incompetence theory?
yeah, exactly.
If you're good at your job, you'll get promoted. And then if you're good at that level, you get promoted again. And if you're good at that, you get promoted again.
Right.
And then when you get to the level where you're no good at it, you're stuck there. So
Yeah.
this is the argument that everybody gets promoted to the level of their incompetence, which does explain rather a lot, really.
That's true. That's true. Although I hear more and more often that it's no longer competence that gets people promotions these days. But we won't talk about that too much because that gets
Ooh.
political really quickly. Yeah. But I just mean, in a world where people say be whatever you want to be, and do whatever you want to do, I think that's a little misleading. If you truly do that, you may struggle unnecessarily if you're doing something that you're not really cut out for. And I suppose that is true, that you could make your way doing just about anything. But if I decided that I wanted to be a painter, I would be living off of scraps out of the garbage can, because nobody would want to see that.
Well, I think there's a lot of people who, because of the kind of education we have now and the sort of the nature of the discourse around us, want to flatter themselves that they're great artists. And because people don't recognise them, that just proves what great artists they are. This is this is a sort of parallel to the, Jesus was perfect and people persecuted him, and people persecute me, therefore I'm like, no, they may just treat you nastily because you're not nice.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's kind of fallacy. Yes.
Yeah. But I think I have a particular chip on my shoulder about this, because I'm part of the generation that, was everybody we were all persuaded into going to college thinking that it would secure us good jobs, and of course it hasn't done that. And so I think I wish that I had had more guidance about what sort of career I should be going into, because I picked something that was kind of far fetched and it didn't really work out very well for me. So,
Which is why you're living in the miserable state that you are now.
yeah, yes, I've corrected course thanks to my husband, who now pampers me. But that was just a stroke of luck, I think, or perhaps delusion to delude him into marrying me. So,
Most marriages happen because one party deludes the other for some reason or other. Yes. Right, I think that's enough of these toxic opinions now.
right,
Move swiftly on. Okay, following this a little further then, people's international cosmopolitan lifestyles and interests are pretty new. So, as recently as 50 or 60 years ago, the only way people actually got to go abroad very far was if they were particularly well off, or they were in the diplomatic service or something like that, or they were involved in a war. So my father's generation, he wasn't in a war, thank goodness, but very nearly in Palestine. It was teetering on the edge of one, but he was in the military. But people just a couple of years older than him, I mean, they got to visit France and Germany and the Netherlands for that reason. Most people didn't until pretty recent times, but also this is again is part of a kind of a pattern of choice. I feel my life has been ridiculously lucky and fortunate in that I've had these contacts, the abilities to travel, to get involved in different things, and so people do this as lifestyle choices, I suppose, as I guess I've done. But sometimes people do it as a form of self-flattery. So, media consumption, music, dress and fashion, intellectual influences, people can be very eclectic. They can choose stuff from all over the world. So, thinking back to the 1970s or the late 60s, it was very hip to buy clothes and take an interest in music that came, say, from India. Right? This was the hippie movement, right? And by choosing that over anything more Western, you were making a statement about yourself that you were a sophisticated kind of person. Whether or not you really were was a very different question. But lots of people make these kinds of choices and have these kinds of contacts for those sorts of reasons. It's part of a process of self-invention.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think going back to being patriotic or a nationalist that we were talking about earlier, I've talked to people that it's almost like cool now to be like part of a crowd that if you're into the media and the music and whatever of another country, it's cool to like elevate that above the country that you're living in, right? Like, you know, oh, these people are so much better off. They know what they're doing. Look how cool they are. We're
Right.
cool because, yeah,
And
we're
again, there's nothing really necessarily wrong with that, but it is all part of this kind of process. That is what's happening. It's making a statement about oneself.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, getting on to more controversial territory here, but it's stuff that we will be driving further into in later episodes in this series. So, the emergence of therapy culture during the course of the 20th century, which by the late 20th century was pretty enormous. Self care and its practices and discourses. So, psychology and psychiatry became really major disciplines during the course of the 20th century, and more of us decided that we needed either this kind of attention for ourselves, or we studied it in an amateurish kind of way because it interested us. We're diving down inside ourselves, either supposedly or actually. And as we get to the late 20th century and into the 21st, then the various kinds of therapy on offer proliferate. So our picture here which looks very AI generated. Apologies for that, people, but maybe no one could actually get into a talking cure group kind of session and take a photograph legitimately, so it was easier to feed whatever parameters into AI and get this. But I think we're all familiar with this kind of idea, right?
Right.
And again, this is now very prominent in Western societies in a way that would have been unthinkable even 2 generations ago, certainly 3 generations ago. Yeah.
Yeah, this one I find interesting because, at least as far as therapy goes, I think it is something that is really important and very necessary for a lot of people today. But that makes me ask the question, what did people do, a couple hundred years ago or 1,000 years ago when therapy was not available to them? Like, why is it that we're in so much need of this now? Yeah.
Well, as I used to say to cohort after cohort of students, this is the psychologically most fragile generation that has ever lived, not by a little bit, but by miles and miles and miles.
Right.
And all my experience teaching students over 30 years, whatever it was, just bore that out.
Yeah.
Um, we are very fragile for reasons that we're going to be getting into in depth, particularly in the third and fourth episodes. Yes.
Yeah.
So there is no need for it.
Yeah, yeah, but I feel like it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy because I think the culture that we live in perpetuates the need because of different factors that maybe we're going to look at, perpetuates the need for therapy. Like if the culture is inventing therapy, then of course you'll continue to need it.
Yeah, so it becomes kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, or a need that gets bigger the more you focus on it. Yeah, I
Sure.
would go with that, and I would want to push back on people who are all in favour of this kind of stuff. And I'm not someone who wants to poo-poo it, or not by any means, but particularly strong proponents of it who would want to say, "Oh, well, that's just because previous generations didn't have the mental furniture, the diagnostics, the understanding of it." And I want to say this is false at 2 levels. One, this is the tired and ridiculous old Western idea that's been around since the 18th century that all of our ancestors were stupid, right? Which is just completely untrue. But secondly, that people in the past really were nothing like as mentally frail or fragile as we were. Now one of the big examples I want to bring up for that is the overwhelming majority of Western soldiers who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan have come back with some level or other of PTSD, right? And I'm not belittling the horrible experiences that they've had at all. But the question I'm asking is, did this happen in previous conflicts? Now, the one example one can point to is the Western Front in World War One, where the nature of the conflict was perhaps more extreme than in any other conflict there has ever been. If you were in a trench and you were being bombarded for hour upon relentless hour, loads of people got what was called shell shock, and they went around the rest of their lives with nervous twitches or making noises every 25 seconds for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And so that's clearly very real. These are people who have been pushed absolutely beyond the limits of endurance in a way that's far worse than what NATO soldiers have endured in recent decades. Right. But that rather large exception aside, most soldiers came back from very nasty conflicts and lived perfectly normal lives. Let's think about this. Before 150 years ago, in most conflicts, you waded into battle with something sharp like a sword and you cut people into pieces, and your friends were cut into pieces around you. And then when the war was over, if you survived, you went back home and you lived normal lives. That wouldn't happen today at all, right? We are very, very fragile, and that's because people are absolutely fragile before they even put on a uniform or get on a plane to go to a combat zone. And that's because of the way that we live. And that's really what this series is going to be about. How did we get to this place, particularly in the third and fourth episodes? We're going to be drilling down into that.
Yeah. For this, what you're talking about specifically, do you think that that is because people in the past, I would imagine, were a lot more comfortable with the idea of death than people are today?
Oh, I hadn't thought about that, but I'm sure you're right. It's become like the last obscenity for us. The vast majority of us, or vast majority, I don't know, a very high percentage of us have never actually seen a dead body. Well, that certainly wouldn't have been true before recent years,
Right.
right? It's all kind of ushered away from our ordinary experience, and we all live a lot longer. Is it the Woody Allen joke about in America death is optional? But because we live a lot longer and a lot more comfortably, we treat it as though it were, even though obviously it's not. Right?
Right.
Yes, I think you're right about that. Yes,
Um,
absolutely. Okay, well, continuing with the theme of individual or chosen identities and outlooks, consider the subject of sexual liberation. The sexual revolution and its consequences we're going to be looking at big time in the third episode. So practices that were once condemned are now tolerated, and once they've been tolerated for a while, they're even approved on principle as self-affirming. Right. So that's, regardless of what we think about that, that is extremely unusual, right? Other societies, some other societies, have had high levels of sexual promiscuity in the past, right? And it's never been absent. But if 16th, 17th century England is remotely typical for pre-modern societies, and I think it was in this respect, illegitimacy rates were around 2 or 3%. Now, again, we can't idealize that because young women who got into serious difficulties were in a terrible situation. Economically, they might starve to death, they could become unmarriageable. Think of the phenomenon, again, right up to very recent times, of the shotgun marriage, right? You did this young man to my daughter. Well, okay, you're going to marry her and I'm going to make you. I could fuck you within an inch of your life. That stuff, right? Okay, and that was the kind of the good outcome from this sort of behaviour. But the bad outcome sometimes led young women committing suicide or killing their babies and then being hanged for murder. Terrible, terrible things.
Right.
But nevertheless, precisely because the consequences were so dire, that in itself served to keep this kind of behaviour down. And the reason I mention that is, again, because I want to push back on the lazy assumption that most Westerners have. Oh, people like this were like this in the past because they were so judgmental or they were so intolerant and so on. No, it was about managing to keep yourself alive.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting sociological point that it is actually unhealthy for a culture to live this kind of way. And I think we see, like you're saying, I think we see the effects of that.
Right, it's pretty nearly ubiquitous in the West now. I mean, even in the 1970s, when I was a college student, I mean, I've made this joke before, but on campus, pretty much the only people who weren't sleeping around were people in the Christian Union and the ugly, and I was doubly protected. And that was then. Right? So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the way that this has become like a right of people, we talk about people's rights and choosing to be able to engage in this kind of activity is like, well, I should be allowed to make that choice if I want to, and it's like if you were even to suggest otherwise to someone, that would just be the absolute worst thing that you could say to them.
Right, right, right. Well, and finally, under this head, then, and this has become yet more prominent in recent decades, is the idea of being gay or transgender as identities, right? So, not simply practices, whether approved of or disapproved of, or practiced secretly or semi secretly or openly, but as being the core of who you were. And that has become very prominent recently. So, if we're looking at this table here in sum, what we've got on the one hand is traditional or inherited outlooks and identities that you're basically born into, born with from your family or your earliest upbringing, and the others are chosen identities, which are part of self curation or self creation. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And and the ones in the right hand column are now, for most people, most of the time, way more important than those on the left hand column. But the trouble with this, and we'll see this as we go through the series, is that if I am simply what I have made myself to be, what the heck is that? Who am I? There's no solidity. I'm basically just invented. I don't belong anywhere,
Yeah,
and
and
that's a cause of insecurity. Yeah.
yeah, and can easily be reinvented. It can change easily, or there's just, it seems like sometimes there's very little substance behind it. Um,
Right.
yeah. But as I was thinking about this, I wonder if one of the reasons that this has become so popular, but also that it's necessary in a way because we don't have the traditional structures to support identity anymore. I think most people just simply don't have enough positive influences left in their life to be able to speak into their identity. And so it's actually safer to just construct it yourself because if you take in somebody else's opinions, then you're likely to run into trouble or they could manipulate you in some way. And so I think the alternative is too scary.
Well, yes, and I think this is particularly true in terms of family relations, but this is something we're going to be talking about in the third and fourth episodes. So, okay, well, that probably about wraps it up today. And next week, we're going to be looking at what makes me me: God, other people, or me. So, as a related theme, but not quite the same one.
Right. So it'll sort of tracing the history of how this came to be.
A little bit, but we're mostly, like today, we're going to be staying in the present largely because we're dealing with very current but fairly recently created major issues that have produced this kind of identity crisis that most people, particularly young people, but even people in early middle age, really, really feel. And that's a kind of a crisis created by the felt need to invent oneself and then reinvent oneself, and the permanent sense of dissatisfaction, self-loathing, and so on that result from that. Yeah. So this sounds a little gloomy, but the reason for looking at this is so that we can understand our present situation and then address the kinds of problems that we confront.
Well, I really think that you should do the closing of the episode in an Irish accent because I think that would really bring this together.
Well, that's very kind of you. Well, no, that's very cruel of you because I'm pretty sure I couldn't do that beyond a few words that might have nothing to do with this. There's only about two accents in the world that I can do at all convincingly, and that is not one of them.
Do you consider a British accent to be one of those two?
That's not an accent. This is the real language, madam.
Right, right. Sorry. I forgot.
So, with that furious finish, we will see you, good people, next week, and thank you for staying with us. So, bye bye now.